He screamed for 7 minutes before his throat gave out. By then, the skin had already begun to peel from his arms in long, red ribbons. Boiling doesn't kill instantly. It devours. It cooks. It paralyzes the lungs with heat and fills the air with the scent of burning flesh and iron. Hundreds watched. No one moved. No one helped. That was the point. The man in the cauldron wasn't a traitor. He hadn't taken up arms against the crown. He hadn't even spilled blood. His name was Richard Roos. His crime allegedly poisoning a bowl of porridge. But this wasn't about justice. It was about theater, about power, about a king so obsessed with control. He wrote cruelty into law. In 1531, Henry VIII, the same king who split with the Catholic Church and sent queens to the scaffold, enacted a new punishment, death by boiling. Not in secret, not in a dungeon, but in the open, before the people his people, so they would remember what defiance tastes like when cooked alive. This was more than a sentence. It was a performance choreographed by a monarch who wanted to be both judge and god, and Richard Roos was just the first. Because behind every royal execution is a message, and in this one, it boiled just beneath the skin. He had been a simple kitchen hand, a cook whose life was measured in the steam of broth and the flicker of hearth flames. But on a cold, damp morning in January of 1531, Richard Roos found himself thrust onto England's grandest stage of horror. His name carved into a law meant to terrify every servant in the land, hired to prepare a humble pot of porridge for Bishop John Fisher's household in Rochester. He stirred oats, water, and butter into a steaming meal entirely unaware he was stirring the powder keg of a royal rage born from paranoia. That evening, 2 people died after taking just 1 bite. 17 more writhed in agony hunched over vessels, vomiting bile into the flickering light of oil lamps. Panic rippled through the household and into Tudor London. The modern mind calls it poisoning. The kingship called it rebellion. No vial was found. No poison master discovered. Just a bowl and a name. Roos stood accused. The court demanded guilt, and the crown craved obedience. He had no noble birth, no scholar's tongue, no army to rally. He was a man of few words, standing in ragged sleeves before judges who cared little for nuance. He spoke of mistakes in seasoning, of reused herbs, of rancid butter. But each explanation seemed feeble, dampened by his shaking voice and haunted eyes. Without advocates, without defense, he faced a hunger far greater than his own, the hunger of a king determined to demonstrate absolute authority. Henry, enthroned in opulence and ambition, had severed ties with Rome less than a decade prior. He had annulled his marriage, executed any who defied him, and demanded the nation kneel at his command. Yet he feared what he could not see. Poison was invisible. It required no blade, no pit, no open contradiction. It happened in whispers and shadows. It happened in kitchens, in glasses, in late-night conversations. For Henry, poison was a contagion not just against the body, but against the monarchy. Thus, in early 1531, Parliament passed a statute so terrifying it made tavern keepers freeze and butchers tremble. This was no ordinary execution. This was not urgent or quick. It was spectacle, a calculated tragedy. Only poisoners would face it. Boiling alive, public, ritualistic, designed to pool fear like blood in the streets. At dawn, smiths and masons assembled a massive iron cauldron in Smithfield, its wide belly set above a hearth so large it swallowed trees. Wood was piled high. Guards cordoned off the square. Merchants who came in search of customers stopped at the sight rooks wheeling overhead. A great pot steaming in the cold air. Men in velvet doublets murmuring with anticipation. Mothers pulled children close. But no prayer escaped lips. Not yet. Roos was dragged through brick lanes, his ankles chained, his face pale as frost on low windows, every eye fixed on him not with hatred, but with a dangerous curiosity. He was led onto a raised platform, bound to a wooden board that slid into the cauldron when he went in. The water was cold. Not a drop had been heated. He did not see fire. He did not see priests. He saw only the crowd, and in their faces, the shape of his fate. The wood beneath the cauldron was lit, at first. Gentle flicker warmed the water to a tepid state. Roos's arms relaxed. He exhaled in what hope remained. Then the flames climbed higher. Bubbles gathered. Hisses turned to roars. His head jerked up. Unbelieving. Then came screams the long, agonizing howl of a man undone not by blood, but by slow, relentless violence. His hands beat the board. His chest heaved. Flesh burned. Flesh peeled. Flesh fell. No official recorded how long it took. Some accounts said 40 minutes. Others whispered near an hour. The laws of that time did not measure human suffering. They only measured obedience. 200 years later. Ballads would remember his screams lasting 7 minutes. The smell of skin. The taste of hot iron, those memories haunted the living. Still, the crowd did not cheer. Some vomited. Some closed their eyes, their breaths shallow. A few unknown souls stepped away, never to speak of what they saw. The water cooled eventually. The flames died. Roos remained motionless. A body. A lesson. A sacrifice. Officials collected ashes, sealing them in a bag bound with the Parliament's seal. The cauldron was cleaned, its iron polished, until it gleamed cold and terrible. The law was written in ink, but its language was pain, its grammar was fear, and every servant in every great house in England heard it loud and clear. You may wash dishes. You may draw baths. But if a child or a lord dies and poison is whispered, your life is no longer yours to take. The crown will take it for you. Publicly. Painfully. Without mercy. Roos's bones were buried. His name was printed. His death recorded in annals that praised the law. But in hushed kitchens, in late-night prayers, in bracing for every meal. Fear lingered. The king had not only eliminated a suspected poisoner, he had infused terror into dining halls across the realm, teaching every servant that even a pot of porridge could become a stage for brutality baked into law. The fire died down, but the cauldron remained. It was emptied, scraped clean, and covered like an altar between rituals. The law passed in the wake of Roos's execution was not revoked, not softened, not forgotten. It sat dormant, quiet, patient, like a loaded weapon waiting to be called upon again. In the years that followed, the statute drifted beneath the surface of English consciousness, occasionally recalled in rumor or fear, but never again applied. Until one spring day in 1542, when the fire found a second name. Margaret Davy was not a criminal. She was not a rebel, a noble, or a political threat. She was a maid, a girl, a background presence in the house of a respectable Tudor family, performing the invisible labor expected of women without title or defense. She cooked, she cleaned, she fetched, and folded. Her days passed in silence, her nights beneath someone else's roof. Her name appeared nowhere in the official rolls of England until her employers fell ill. The sickness came quickly after supper. Vomiting. Sweating. One of the children fainted. The lord of the house clutched his stomach as if struck by some invisible force. Doctors were summoned. Prayers offered. But as recovery took hold, and death failed to arrive, the question of blame found its mark not in heaven or medicine, but in the kitchen. And there, they found Margaret. No poison was discovered, no vial, no motive, no confession, only the proximity of a servant who had handled the meal, and the echo of a law almost forgotten. Someone, perhaps a neighbor, perhaps a clerk, remembered Smithfield, and the cook who had boiled, the statute stirred, and Margaret was taken. She did not scream. She did not run. There is no record of resistance. Her interrogation was brief, unceremonious. She was frightened. She stumbled over answers, contradicted herself in panic. At one point, she mentioned spoiled meat or a batch of herbs that smelled wrong. It was enough. The machinery of the old law rumbled to life. The Crown did not need evidence. It needed performance. And so Margaret Davy was sentenced to death by boiling. The notice was brief. There was no trial, no formal jury, just a signature, a seal, and a date. The old iron cauldron was dragged from storage, cleaned again, stoked and filled. It had not been used in over a decade, but its memory had not faded. The site chosen was Smithfield. As before, the place where animals were slaughtered, where heretics had burned, where public pain became political language. Margaret was led through the city at dawn. Witnesses described her as quiet, small, wrapped in a plain wool dress. No shoes. Her wrists were bound, but loosely, as if no one believed she would resist. She was not the kind of woman who shouted. She was the kind who disappeared. The crowd that gathered was smaller than for Rose. Those who remembered that execution had aged, or chosen not to return. But still. A few hundred stood shoulder to shoulder as Margaret was brought to the platform. The cauldron steamed. The air was heavy with dew and dread. The fire beneath it crackled, licking up at the base with the same appetite it had shown a decade earlier. There was no ceremony, no proclamation, no sermon, only the rusted groan of rope and the thud of wood as Margaret was lowered into the water. It was cold, then warm, then unbearable. She did not cry out, not at first. Her body jerked, spasmed, fought against the heat. But her face, those who saw it said, remained disturbingly calm, a kind of resignation, or perhaps confusion. Perhaps she had never truly believed this was real. Perhaps, in her final moments, she still hoped someone might stop it. No one did. Witnesses recalled the smell first: burning hair, boiled cloth, flesh splitting like fruit in the sun. A few turned away. Others wept. One woman vomited into her shawl, but the law had to speak, and it spoke through steam. The executioners remained silent. The guards kept order. The crowd endured it because they had been told it was justice, because in Tudor England, not looking was its own form of guilt. When it ended, Margaret Davy was gone, physically obliterated, spiritually erased. There was no body to bury, only remains. No words to remember her by, only silence. And in that silence, something shifted. Whispers spread, not loud, not in court, but in kitchens, in churches, in the low voices of women cleaning blood from stones. The story was too brutal to vanish, the image too grotesque to ignore. Margaret became not a martyr, but a question about power, about cruelty, about what it means to destroy someone not for what they've done, but for what they might have meant. The law that killed her would not last much longer, but it had done its work. It had reminded England that fear was a tool, and that even the smallest life could be sacrificed if the king needed a warning carved into the flesh of the innocent. And for that, the cauldron boiled again. The cauldron cooled, but its echo did not fade. In the weeks that followed Margaret Davy's death, whispers rose from taverns to cathedrals. It was not simply fear she left behind. It was a gathering storm of outrage. Quiet conversations swelled into urgent calls for accountability. In London's Inns of Court, lawyers debated whether any monarch should wield a punishment so savage without trial or transparency. In grand manners, household servants exchanged theories in hushed tones. Could any accusation, true or false, send them to that same steaming fate? The political climate shifted. The nobility, already uneasy with Henry's religious transformations, sensed a new kind of vulnerability, A punishment once directed at commoners now felt dangerously close to eliminating deeper resistances. Foreign envoys reported back to European capitals with grave concern. In Rome, diplomatic correspondents described Victoria England's new capacity for cruelty, a sovereign willing to burn his own soil in public. Across the English Channel in Paris, whispers warned that English power had become unpredictable, an ember of tyranny that threatened alliances built on trust. Within the halls of Parliament, murmurs turned to cautious speech. Criticism did not come openly. No one spoke of treating Britain like France. No one compared the cauldron to foreign tyranny. But beneath the sheen of allegiance, there was tension. Henry's advisors, uneasy with the spectacle they had sanctioned, began drafting amendments surrounding evidence standards and jurisdiction. Their words were measured, their voices steady. No law should allow a man's life to extinguish in a cauldron without clear testimony. The proposals were blocked by royal decree, but the seed was planted. Within the Church of England, the bishops wrestled with their conscience. They had embraced Henry as supreme head, seeing in him a new order of national unity. But few could reconcile doctrine with the brutal dance of boiling flesh. Sermons grew solemn, referencing mercy in passing. One bishop, writing to a colleague, described the execution as an exercise in spectacle that weighs heavy on the soul. The letter circulated, copied clandestinely across dioceses. Adding fuel to an uneasy truth obedience to the crown did not mean complicity in cruelty. Yet the law stood. Officials reminded every household that it remained on the statute books. They dispatched copies of the Parliamentary Act to county clerks across England. They held public readings of the penalties. They wanted the populace to remember they could do it again. It was not justice. It was deterrence made physical. A terrifying argument tyranny is not neutralized until it defines the shapes of daily life. In remote villages, the gossip took hold in stifled narratives. A baker in Kent told of a neighbor who saw smoke rising from a place she'd never been certain was Smithfield. An elderly farmhand claimed he dreamed of a woman's face in boiling water. Fiction grew in the form of ghost stories. The cauldron became legend. It embodied the rage of the crown. Henry himself remained outwardly confident. He hosted tournaments, announced marriages, met ambassadors in velvet halls. On the surface, he retained his swagger. But there were cracks the court, once bustling with merriment, began to feel tense. At feasts, conversation halted when news arrived of outbreaks overseas. At council meetings, debate sharpened with every question about tyranny and legitimacy. Henry dismissed concerns with a wave. It was poisoners who burned. He said, they deserved no mercy. But his advisors heard the tremor in his voice. Abroad, the story gained traction. Spanish envoys cautioned their king about treaties with a realm willing to burn innocents. The Holy Roman Empire watched England with suspicion. Treaty negotiations faced unforeseen delays. After centuries of cautious diplomacy, Western leaders struggled to maintain relations with a sovereign who used terror as legislation. Back home, public sentiment turned. Parishioners skipped Mass when bishops mentioned mercy. Servants refused to fetch wine for lords during supper, muttering about fear beneath polished veneers. The nation's psyche shifted quietly. Where once there was trust in the word of a monarch, now there was a tremor of disbelief, and feigned loyalty became the currency of survival. When Henry died in 1547, the pressure heaped upon his heir was immense. Edward VI inherited a throne weighed down by cruelty. Advisors bypassed the Parliament Act that sent poisoners to the cauldron. Within months, the statute was repealed. The iron pot was pulled from Smithfield, melted and reforged into church bells in its place. Members of Parliament drafted statutes emphasizing due process, proportionality, restraint for England. The horror of boiling had proven to be more than a punishment. It was a lesson upon which a new judicial conscience was built. Margaret Davy's death became pivotal. It moved the silent law into the light, and forced change. It reminded England that cruelty, once set into motion, cannot be reined in until a society reckons with its own methods of governance. The fire of that boiling law left its mark not only on flesh, but on the bones of a nation, in the legacy of repeal, in the practice of mercy. England found a reflection of its better self, and in the hearts of those who witnessed it, and those who learned the story later. The cauldron remained a warning, a place where obedience and justice had parted ways, and a sovereign's gaze became the instrument of terror. The law was gone, but the memory refused to follow. Even as Edward VI's council struck the statute from the record, no one dared pretend it had not existed. The cauldron, once cooled and broken down into harmless iron, left behind more than rust. It left behind something invisible and harder to dismantle, the emotional wreckage of a nation haunted by state-sanctioned fire, for those who had seen it, those who had known someone accused, and those who had simply heard the tale whispered between chapel pews. The fear lingered long after the law was dead. In the countryside, midwives warned each other in hushed tones, "Be careful what you say to the wrong ear." In city taverns, men who had once toasted the king now kept their voices low, their opinions buried beneath tankards. For years, the boiling law had created a landscape where rumor was as lethal as a weapon. The cauldron had taught England that justice could be twisted into theater, and that even silence could be punished if it was witnessed the wrong way. Stories spread faster than any decree. Margaret Davy's name became a shadowy presence in folk ballads and broadsides, not as a woman of rebellion, but as a figure caught in something far larger than herself. Children sang of the maid who boiled like broth, while mothers swore to never speak the name aloud after dark. The narrative changed with every telling. Sometimes she was innocent, sometimes a witch, sometimes a saint. But in every version, the cauldron remained hot, waiting, and sanctioned by a crown that once called it justice. The cultural wound was deeper than any statute. Pain that is made public becomes its own form of ritual. The sight of flesh breaking under steam, of eyes rolling back into the head, of lips mouthing prayers while submerged in boiling judgment, these did not vanish from collective consciousness. They imprinted themselves into architecture and memory. No one built gallows in Smithfield again. No one dared place a bonfire in its square. It was now marked, unofficially, as sacred ground, sacred not by divine presence, but by human terror. Writers of the Elizabethan era avoided the subject. Too recent, too raw. But the silence was revealing. The absence of boiling-in plays, pamphlets, and public discourse spoke volumes. The nation had flinched, then collectively turned its face. This did not mean it had forgotten. It meant it had chosen never to confront the violence directly. Instead, it bled sideways into legends of spectral women crying from beneath cobblestones, into architectural details that echoed the curve of the pot, into the way even the word Smithfield invoked unease in those who had seen too much. Over time, new generations arrived, unburdened by the first-hand memory, but the lessons endured, passed in glances, warnings, superstitions. The idea that power could become cruelty was no longer abstract. It had been made real, seen, and sanctioned. English law began to change, not just through formal repeal, but through hesitation. Judges became slower to sentence. Trials leaned more heavily on testimony, less on rumor. The fear had not made England more just, it had made it cautious, as though the entire legal system had recoiled from its own reflection. And then came the satirists, writers in later reigns, too distant to be threatened by Henry's ghost, but close enough to understand the implications, began to insert coded references into their works. They did not name Margaret, but they described women punished for crimes they never understood. They didn't mention Roos, but spoke of cooks executed for meals never tasted. They created allegories, thin veils over real trauma. These texts weren't simply literature, they were societal therapy, an attempt to process the unprocessable without reopening the wound completely. The boiling law had also marked the servants. In homes across England, the master-servant relationship changed subtly. It had always been hierarchical, always steeped in control. But after Smithfield, a new element entered the dynamic mutual suspicion. Lords feared poison, servants feared accusation. Meals were now arenas of distrust. Food was inspected more closely. Staff were changed more frequently. A glance between cook and mistress carried the weight of paranoia, and within that gap, the memory of the cauldron lived on. Even the church felt its scars. Sermons about mercy had a harder edge. Preachers invoked divine justice with greater care. Parishioners, once dutiful in confession, became guarded. The line between sin and punishment had blurred. If boiling was legal once, could it be again? The question hovered in holy spaces, unanswered. England, having survived its encounter with such grotesque power, never returned to boiling as a punishment. But it didn't need to. The act had already reshaped the nation's psyche. It served as a reminder not just of tyranny, but of collective complicity. The crowd had watched. The council had written the law. The people had spoken of it in whispers, but not in revolt. And so it endured not as a mistake, but as a mirror. By the time Queen Elizabeth ascended the throne, the memory had faded into superstition, and the records had been thinned by time. But even then, in the minds of servants passing Smithfield, or children hearing bedtime rhymes too dark to be explained, the story remained. Not because it was famous, but because it was true. The law had ended, but its shadow moved with the kingdom. Generations passed. Monarchs rose and fell. And yet within the deepest folds of English justice, the memory of the cauldron remained embedded not in ink or parchment, but in instinct, in the way a lord's voice lowered when speaking of treason, in how a judge paused before passing a sentence too harsh, in the silence that followed when someone dared speak Margaret Davy's name aloud. No institution escaped the imprint. Legal scholars in later centuries would examine the period with surgical precision, tracing how a single act of fear-driven brutality shaped the very mechanisms meant to prevent its recurrence. They found something strange in the decades that followed Margaret's execution, a sudden rise in hesitation within the courts. Trials became longer, testimonies more heavily scrutinized. The presumption of guilt, once enough to send a man into the fire, began to erode under the pressure of collective shame. The English common law system, revered by the American colonies centuries later, grew not from triumph, but from retreat from the edge of its own cruelty. Even royal power was not left untouched. Henry VIII had wielded the boiling law like a sword, but in doing so, he exposed something even his successors could not control. It showed the monarchy's need to be feared could cross a line so visible, so visceral. That fear turned inward. Nobles began to question their proximity to power. Councils grew more careful with what they signed, and though the monarchy retained its grandeur, its hands were a little less free. The execution of Margaret Davy had chained not only her body, but the throne itself. Outside courtrooms and palaces, in the murk of daily life, the cultural tremor continued. Artists took up the subject with discretion, embedding it in stage tragedy and manuscript marginalia. A play performed in 1581 featured a queen's cook who wept over a bubbling pot not from fear, but guilt. A painting from the early 1600s depicted an empty iron kettle on a stone platform, steam curling toward a sky without sun. The image had no caption. It needed none. These quiet expressions carried forward a reckoning. They did not glorify rebellion. They asked instead whether obedience, when wielded blindly, was itself a crime. The question traveled. When English colonists crossed the Atlantic, they brought with them a legal culture steeped in the belief that law must never again serve spectacle over substance in the distant settlements of the New World, where gallows were still raised and trials still flawed. Echoes of Smithfield lingered in caution, in restraint, in the deeply American suspicion of unchecked power. But the legacy was not limited to law. The psychology of boiling as punishment reached into the collective subconscious, altering how cruelty was remembered and how it was passed between generations. For some, it became a cautionary tale of monarchy's excess, of a servant's helplessness, of justice turned violent theater. For others, it hardened belief in order, in fear as a necessary tool. The law had been abolished, but the idea behind it that fear could control society better than fairness never truly died. It simply changed clothes. It returned in whispers of surveillance, in the quiet acceptance of violence done out of sight, in the belief that some lives are worth less when order is at stake. In that way, the boiling law outlived Henry VIII. It lived in every system that preferred obedience to understanding, in every institution that punished before it listened, and in every moment when fear shaped the law more than truth ever could. But where cruelty endures, memory resists. Margaret Davy became a kind of ghost in the legal imagination of England. No statue stands in her name. No grave marks her resting place. And yet her absence is palpable, in the very absence of boiling in English punishment after her death. She is present. She is the line they would not cross again, the body the nation could not unsee. Rose, too, despite his vague and contradictory confession, occupies that strange space between criminal and scapegoat. His death, orchestrated as warning, became instead a point of rupture. Those who watched did not forget, and those who heard the story secondhand understood the law had gone too far. Justice cannot be spectacle. Punishment must never become ritual. The cauldron has vanished, its iron repurposed, its ashes swept clean. But in every courtroom where reason is weighed against fear, in every statute written to preserve dignity instead of vengeance, the steam still lingers, not because we remember the pain, but because we must. The executions have long since faded from the record, but their heat never truly cooled. Not in the streets where they happened, not in the laws that followed, and not in the memory of a nation that still walks carefully around the question of what power becomes when it stops pretending to be human. Richard Roos died without trial. Margaret Davy died without cause. Neither held power, influence, or voice. Their names should have disappeared into the dust of Tudor England. But they didn't, because their deaths marked something more than punishment. They exposed the fault line beneath a kingdom desperate to be obeyed. They revealed the cost of silence, the ease with which fear can be dressed up as law, and how quickly a society will look away if the spectacle is loud enough. No monuments stand in their memory, no royal apology followed. But the law that killed them was erased, the tools that boiled them were broken, and the very notion of public torture in English justice collapsed under the weight of its own performance. That collapse mattered. It mattered not because it made England more merciful overnight, but because it forced a reckoning that would echo into revolutions, charters, and constitutions far beyond its shores. The question now is not whether the cauldron existed. It did. The question is what it still means, whether justice today carries its own steam, whether our laws remember the faces of those who once boiled inside them. And if we still do,